Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to have a build of an Airfix vintage classic, the 1/72nd scale M3 American World War II Halftrack. And I'll leave a link in the description to Techtonic Hobbies website where you can buy this and many other kits. And we're a local shop on the Sunshine Coast, so do drop in if you live there. But anyways, all that aside, let's get into it. Upon opening the box, you are greeted with 4 sprues of green moulded plastic and a set of instructions and decals. Before assembling the kit, I give all the parts a wash in some warm soapy water. Now technically this footage is of me cleaning some other sprues, but it gives you a general idea of how I wet them in a little bit of water with some soap, and after they've soaked for a bit, dry them gently with a towel. After the parts have been dried, I then begin to cut the ones I need out of the sprue, using either a set of sprue cutters, or when they're too large to reach apart, I'll use a knife. Assembly begins with the front drive shaft system and the wheels, and then you cut out the chassis. Once the chassis has been removed from the sprue, I use a sanding file to sand away some of the excess sprue to make it smooth on the sides, and then I glue the exhaust system in place. I then cut out the rear half-track section of the vehicle, which is all moulded in one piece with some pretty nice details and not an awful lot of cleanup required. The 2 track halves fit together quite nicely to the chassis, and then after they're put into position, I thread the exhaust pipe through the middle of them, and then I glue the front drive shaft system and the front road wheels on. With the chassis now sitting on its, half tracks, I then move on to building the armoured structure. There's a few parts that make it up, including 2 side pieces, a floor for the rear section of the fighting compartment, or the place where the soldiers would sit, and there's a bulkhead that then separates it from the driver's compartment. The sides fitted together pretty nicely. There was a tiny bit of flash on some of the parts, but I cleaned them up with a little bit of sanding and then glued the parts into place. They fit together quite nicely and there wasn't really any noticeable gaps. I decided to cut the door out of the rear exit so I could open and close it during stop motions and other sorts of things, and then once I'd done that I glued it into place. With most of the main armoured body of the vehicle assembled, I then started to cut out some of the finer parts to add them into place. There are a few nice little accessories, although a little bit of cleanup was required on a fair few of them, because they had a few injector pin marks in some awkward places, and also there was a little bit of burring and some imperfections from the mould. The details included a set of seats for the rear fighting compartment along with the distinctive fuel tanks that sit in the centre, a little instrument panel with some of the dials and a steering wheel that attaches to the hood or the bonnet of the vehicle, a couple of little fenders that go onto the sides, which also had some lighting accessories which I'd glue into place later, a towing hatch at the back of the vehicle, and there were also a couple of little side parts to add in some accessories that the soldiers and the crew would have been carrying with them. I then glued the hood and the front driver's plate into position. The vision slits on the vehicle are moulded in the open position, but that's alright because most half-tracks would have been driving around with them open anyways and pretty rarely under actual fire. I removed the parts for the 50 cal from the sprue and also glued into place the headlights onto the fenders since they were now nice and dry. I found that the 50 cal mount, especially the base, had some pretty nasty imperfections. I did manage to patch it up with a little bit of sanding for the base, but later on, as I'll show you, I had a lot more problems with the O-ring that the 50 cal actually mounts to and is supposed to swivel freely with. I then glued into place the weird rolling part at the front of the vehicle. After a quick Google search, I discovered it's an unditching roller which helps the vehicle get out of, ditches and also obstacles such as trenches. I then glued the bodywork of the vehicle to the chassis and it fitted quite nicely into place, and then I glued the front unditching roll onto the bumper. I did attempt to attach the 50 cal ring mount to the base. However, due to both the parts being bent and distorted due to their imperfections, they didn't really fit together well, and you couldn't really rely on friction to have it hold into place like the model intended. There's also a nice little standard US Army trailer that's included with the half-track. Assembly for this trailer is pretty easy. There's a little axle that attaches the 2 halves of the trailer together, and then you attach them to the floor of the trailer. There's a front and a rear panel to be added, and also a canvas roof included. You can get the axle to spin freely if you do not glue it to the sides of the trailer, and there's also some hubs included to keep the wheels in place. Overall, it's a nice little assembly and a good little detail for dioramas or to go along with the vehicle. Once assembly is finally complete, I begin to hand paint several layers of Tamiya XF62 olive drab to both the M3 Halftrack and its included trailer. Now, I'm well aware that a lot of people think that hand painting a model such as this is absolutely awful craftsmanship. However, I personally find that hand painting models is a lot easier in terms of cleaning up, and frankly, if you have the right technique and you've practiced a lot, you can get a finish with hand painting that is still pretty much the same as airbrushing, if not better in some cases. I use a lot of different techniques to ensure this, such as making sure the paint is nice and thin with water, but not too thin that it doesn't conform to the model, by applying the paint in the same direction as much as possible, which helps to reduce visible brush strokes, and also building the paint up in several layers rather than attempting to do one thick coat of paint to cover the model entirely. Now, at some point I do intend to play around a little bit with an airbrush, and maybe then my mind will be changed, but I still enjoy doing the hand painting quite a lot, and personally I think the main thing about this hobby is not necessarily to get everything done perfectly, but to have fun while you're doing it and every now and again have a go at something new. I begin to apply a second and later on a third coat of olive drab. I would also later on then apply a fourth coat, which shows how many layers I build up of the paint. As you can see between the layers, you start to gradually see less of the base colour of the light green plastic show through, and it becomes gradually darker and more, well, olivey drab. You'll also notice that I use the tracks on the vehicle and part of the trailer's hitching point as a handle, and leave it unpainted while I paint the first 4 coats of olive drab on the rest of the vehicle, and then later on I paint them also a few coats of olive drab. The vehicle receives a 5th and final coat of paint before I'm finally satisfied with the final colour and the texture. I also would like to make a little note that with the Tamiya paints, they're designed to be both thinned with either water, or you can use a special lacquer, especially if you're using them in an airbrush. I use a fine brush to apply some Vallejo 70950 model colour flat black onto the front road wheels tyres, and also for the rubber on the bogie. Following this, I made the grave mistake of painting the tracks XF16 flat aluminium, thinking they were made out of metal like most tank tracks. However, on the M3 Halftrack they are rubber, which I will later correct. I also use the XF16 to apply a bit of metal chipping by dabbing it onto the raised details on the sprocket and idler wheel, and also I use it to paint the machine gun barrel. XF52 flat earth and XF51 khaki drab were used to paint the seats inside the vehicle, and also for accessories such as the wooden handles on the tools and the machine gun. And then I applied a little bit of olive drab to neaten up any mistakes I made on the wheels, and some XF16 flat aluminium onto the headlights. For the rear lights on both the M3 Halftrack and its included trailer, I painted them initially some XF16 flat aluminium, and later on I'll apply some X27 transparent red to create a nice tail light effect. I used a bit of white and black to paint the dials, although I couldn't really get any footage because it's such a tight space, and then I painted some XF51 khaki drab onto the canvas cover for the trailer and neatened up the front headlights. Moving on to the decals, I grabbed the transfer paper and placed it in some warm water, and once the transfers started to become loose from the sheet, I then used a brush to help place them onto the model. I also used my finger to help position the decals, and once I'd put them all onto the model and was happy with their position, I got out a little bit of Vallejo decal softener and applied it using a cotton tip in a gentle rolling motion. This helps to soften the decals and make them a little bit better at conforming to the surface and the details, and then I apply a bit of decal adhesive from Tamiya to help them adhere better to the model and stick down nicely. I then used some olive drab to paint the jerry cans while waiting for the decals to dry, and I also started to paint the driver figure included. I used khaki drab for his uniform and then set him aside to dry, and in the meantime applied a little bit of X27 clear red onto the tail lights to create the clear light effect I was talking about earlier. My ranting at the local model club whilst working on this kit led one of the guys there to suggest I sand the base for the 50 cal mount till it was nice and flat. So I gave it a go using some thicker sandpaper and gradually working down to a finer grade, and then painting it olive drab. I found in the end that this made it nice and smooth, and the 50 cal mount once again fitted to the model as it was intended. I also painted the crew figure's helmet olive drab as well. With the decals now fully dried after 24 hours, I then got a relatively old and sprayed out brush and dabbed it in a little bit of XF16 flat aluminium. I then made sure that the paint was pretty dry when I applied it and began to dab it on the areas where I wanted to create some metal chipping. I used a finer brush as well for some of the finer areas such as the hatches and the door handles, and the larger brush was used for things such as the mud guards and the raised surfaces on the vehicle. With the chipping, I focus on the edges of various surfaces which are more likely to be scratched by things like trees, dirt or rocks, and also the areas where the crew and the soldiers in the fighting compartment would be walking around and possibly scratching stuff with their gear. One unfortunate thing I've noticed is that after a little bit of time the Tamiya paints do seem to go a little bit off, and in this case the flat aluminium was pretty much spent and it was very dry. So dry in fact that it sometimes didn't adhere to the model, and I found I could rub it off with a little bit of my finger. I had a spare can of some TS80 flat clear spray, so I decided to apply over the entire model to seal them in so I would not end up with a sparkly half-track. I'm not 100% sure if TS is the best stuff to use on plastic model kits, however it didn't seem to have any ill effects except for being a little bit white on the top of the model, but I believe that's more because I accidentally made it a little bit too wet when I was spraying it. Either way, I was still pretty happy with the result, and it definitely sealed in the flat aluminium, so I could apply some panel liner onto the running gears, the road wheel, and also on the machine gun to darken some of the metal effects, and also highlight the details and add some shading. I also applied it to the tracks before I later corrected them, and after it had dried, I then got out some Vallejo mud and grass effects and used a cocktail stick to apply it into the areas where the tracks are and the road wheels are, which would be likely to get very muddy and dirty. I also applied it into the fighting compartment because a lot of the soldiers would be traipsing in mud and grass on their boots. And at this point I finally corrected my tracks by painting them Vallejos black to make them like rubber. Thanks to the gentle guidance of the Chieftain, whose videos are available on YouTube. He's done various collaborations and a series of videos with Wargaming World of Tanks called Inside the Chieftain's Hatch. Definitely recommend them as a great source for modelling. He goes into a lot of fine details and you get a good idea on how the vehicles you're making actually work. But anyways, getting back to the kit, I finished up painting the tracks and the underside of the half-track flat black to create some shading, before getting out some Vallejo flat flesh to paint the face of the driver figure, and some XF64 red-brown to paint the driver's belt, and also the leather straps on the jerry cans. The exhaust was painted X31 Titan gold, and then I used some flat aluminium to paint some of the finer details on the tools that I'd missed. The final stage was to do a little bit of weathering using the Tamiya weathering powders, which are a sort of pigmenty set of colours that can be activated with a little bit of water, but also thinned too with a bit of water once they've been applied onto the model. I applied it on the areas where I wanted to create dirt, and especially on the sides of the vehicle. I used both a large and a fine brush to drag it down the sides to create some sort of streaking effects over the side, like dirt had been washed over the side over the time, and also a fair bit in the fighting compartment floor, both dark and light, to create some extra dirt effects. I also built up a little bit of dirt on the sides of the trailer, especially on the canvas roof cover and inside some of the finer parts of the vehicle, before painting a little bit of flat earth onto the tools for their wooden parts. The driver received a final coat of flat flesh and some basic skin tone before I used a bit of panel liner on his body to help highlight his details and make him look a bit dirty, and I did the same technique on the jerry cans before cutting them out and gluing them to the sides of the half-track. I used a fine brush to apply a little bit of rust effects on the gold exhaust, and with that, the M3 Halftrack by Airfix in 1/76 scale was finally complete. So overall, this is probably not the best kit out there of the M3 Halftrack. It's in 76 scale, which is a little bit annoying because that's a little bit smaller than 72nd, and with a larger vehicle like this you begin to really notice. The details aren't the best, but they're still pretty decent. However, a lot of cleanup is involved with the kit, especially with the older parts. However, it's still a pretty easy kit to put together. It doesn't cost too much at $25. Maybe it should be closer to $20 or $15 given that it's an older model, but $25 still seems fairly reasonable to me. If you're after a nice easy build of the M3 Halftrack or a little easy project to do over the weekend, this is a good kit for you. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and feel free to leave any suggestions or any questions that you have in the comment section down below. And a big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund my videos. I've been especially excited to reach 1,000 subscribers in the last month, which has been awesome. And I've got many more stop motions planned, and of course there'll be some more model videos and a few little inbox reviews along the way. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, and thanks again, Until the next one, model on.